Welcome to Reality Check. Good afternoon. I'm Serena. This is Ashley, and we're excited to have Matt Jackman here with us today on Reality Check. Matt is the founder of the Australian Centre for Lived Experience and an international peer-run consultant practice. They've been a global health activists promoting human rights, social justice, and lived experience perspective from a public health and a MAD studies discipline, which we're going to talk to you more about. Why don't you start by telling us more about you and how you came to be working in this subject matter of mad science?
Yeah, so I'm Matt. I'm a person with lived experience of madness or distressing madness. As for me, madness isn't always distressing. What that might be categorized as illness or a disorder. But yeah, I grew up with a mother who had a lot of mental health issues and experienced a lot of distress as a result of intergenerational trauma, and a grandmother that really had no choice in having children and unfortunately imparted a lot of that, I think, frustration and resentment onto her. So that, along with marrying my father and her parents disapproving of that marriage, was left as a young woman sort of socially abandoned in a domestically abusive relationship and living in poverty, which was not her upbringing, and having 3 young children by the time she was 24. So a lot of social and structural issues really surrounded the context for her distress and madness. And you had a lot of postpartum issues with my younger brother. I'm the eldest of 3, and unfortunately it got worse for her, and we were put in foster care for a period of time. And yeah, she had suicided during that time that I was in foster care. So my last memories of her are in a psychiatric unit around the time of sort of formal deinstitutionalization in the late 90s. So there wasn't a great deal amount of community support either at that time. And then I continued to grow up in a fairly abusive home, and a lot of my survival and trauma and grief responses began to be pathologized. And I was also dealing with my sexuality on top of that in a largely religious and homophobic neighborhood that was very multicultural. So yeah, there were, I guess, accumulation of personal and carer issues, as well as growing up in a fairly unstable upbringing that, yeah, led me to my own, distress and madness that then was sort of pathologized by the system. So yeah, that's a bit of a snapshot of, I guess, my upbringing and I guess how I perceived and understood a lot of my experiences that were labeled as various mental health diagnoses from more of a social, cultural, and political lens.
Thank you for sharing that. And you've spoken widely on this, and I've watched some of your videos and testimony, and they're very compelling. And we'll include some of those in the links below this for others to watch and to hear you share more details or different details in those interviews. Can you tell our listeners and watchers a little bit about the Australian Centre for Lived Experience?
Yeah, so the Australian Centre for Lived Experience, or TACFLE, was originally conceived as I felt like there was little community around the MAD movements. And the MAD movements are plural movements that are really led and driven by people with lived experience, where the term MAD, much like queer, has been reclaimed from its historical pejorative use. Of course, not everyone identifies with that term, and in our communities there's a lot of difference and dissidence around what terminology we use to identify with, whether it's with the system, such as consumer, service user, patient, or identities outside of the system, whether that's psychosocial disability, psychiatric survivor, or MAD. There's, a lot of plural identities that people identify with. But I felt like there was a lack of physical community and even virtual community in the MAD movements, bringing activists together that were trying to work towards better mental health care, both within systems, but also outside of systems, and what more humane and just worlds look like that often create and embed the conditions of distress. So yeah, I really started that with a few other friends who were also identified as MAD people. and have slowly built that up to be both a consultancy, but also coaching and supervision for lived experience advocates and people that are working within peer roles within the system, as well as enabling a lot of systems advocacy and collaborations with universities and global mental health advocacy bodies. So, yeah, I've been fortunate to attend a lot of high-level spaces with the UN and the World Health Organization in influencing human rights and social justice orientated policy around mental health, and also opening up the explanatory frameworks beyond the predominant biomedical one to the more of a social, cultural, spiritual, and political framework for how we both conceptualize distress and distressing madness, but also how we respond and care and heal for distress and distressing madness. So, yeah, I use those terms instead of mental illness as they sit a bit more comfortably with me and my experiences. Yeah.
That's amazing. I guess how would, if you were to offer like mini consulting right now, but how would you help? What would be your approach to sort of helping someone that's initially having these experiences that are being labeled by people around them, misunderstood by people around them, and so on, with how they then intersect with the mental health system and wherever they actually live? Like, it's so much different. It's even different in the United States within, like, I'm a child adolescent psychiatrist, even with like child psychiatry as approach, like how people are approached versus people that are primarily seeing adults. But I guess within systems, there's such a difference in approach, and then like between different countries. And so in your work with people all over the world, what is sort of your like, or I guess all encompassing strategy or best way to sort of have someone feel that they can have like a healthy intersection with these systems, and then with them, with like themselves and what they're dealing with, their distress? That was a long question. I hope it made sense.
Yeah, it's a really good question, or multiple questions that have, I think, a lot of layers, because particularly in the global mental health like discourse in that field and area, there's a lot of talk around kind of universalizing, Western exploitation of medicine and psychiatry to the global South, the global majority. And I think we're at a point of acknowledging and also not romanticizing local and indigenous wisdom and practices as well that might be harmful. So for me, I guess firstly, it's about people having the option and the knowledges of understanding their experiences that are not just primarily the psychiatric paradigm, that are beyond that. And maybe that is from, more local indigenous cultural understandings of distress and distressing madness, but also just healing practices, which are often, peer-led and mutual aid-driven and family-orientated, sometimes spiritual, sometimes religious. So I think there's, part A is about people having the option and being aware of the different, knowledge frameworks for understanding their experiences beyond any one particular framework. And then part B of that is people should also have the choice, autonomy, and awareness of what sort of practices, healing practices or interventions they think will work best for them. So I'm always very led and driven by people having the solutions from within themselves, whether that's a person, a family, a community, and being led by people's wisdom. So that's sort of how I would go about that and negotiate that. But at the end of the day, for me, like the MAD movements are really around people's self-determination, their choice, their agency and autonomy. So, but as humans, we don't also always have all the knowledge and access to knowledge
Right.
and awareness of what exists. So it's
Yeah.
important to have those dialogues and discussions too,
Yeah, I love the idea of like shared imparting of wisdom from the individual perspective and the humanism side, and with people from all of the different layers of your own community as part of as kind of the general like ultimate solution that could be applied no matter where you are.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think about my own like journey and story, and for me, I have a very strong understanding of my own distress and or madness as a response to bullying in the workplace, in response to childhood abuse and trauma, in response to complex grief and dealing with the suicide, but also loss of, grandparents and siblings to, the mental health system. And as you say, like in adult psychiatry, adult mental health spaces, there just seems to be a lot less hope and a more negative view of people's recovery as opposed to like the child and adolescent space. So yeah, it's important to like listen to people's stories and get a sense of how they understand the evolution of their experiences, because we don't have any one answer to madness as a philosophy, as a concept, as a reality. So there's some level of intellectual humility to just trust people's own wisdom and their own frameworks for how they understand their experiences and how they think they can be best supported through their experiences.
Do you think that as we are changing the way we approach madness and we support people in different ways, that the ability we will be able to better hold out hope for the adults for whom there hasn't been hope in the past?
Yeah, I do think so. I think the system, I mean, we have to acknowledge the system is still predominantly a psychiatric paradigm. So there's still a strong biomedical lens of understanding distress and distressing madness through an illness, disorder, and disease paradigm, which I think can be quite harmful when that's the predominant paradigm, as I feel like that narrative does perpetuate a lack of hope and a sense of it's either curable or incurable, which, as we know, is just not the truth. As people with any diagnoses, and yeah, as we've seen with research over time, we know that people can recover and live meaningful lives irrespective of whatever diagnosis they've received or experience of madness they live with. So yeah, I do have hope. I mean, I started my career in a forensic hospital at the pointy end, working with people that were found not guilty by reasons of mental impairment of a particular crime. So I've worked at the pointy end of, where harm and madness may, and even in those spaces, we absolutely carry a lot of hope and understand the consequences and context for how people, often ended up in situations where madness and harm did intersect. So whether that be trauma or disconnection or poverty or violence and harm in people's own lives. Yeah, I think that there is hope, and I'm hopeful that like having a more understanding framework for madness, a more compassionate and humane framework, it will hopefully imbue people having a sense of understanding that recovery is, possible for anyone.
We're here doing this work because we're hopeful and having this podcast because we live in that space where we believe that changing the course of how we approach this, elevating the lived experience and engaging individuals and in shared decision making is the way towards making change and providing better care. To your point, the systems that exist are not always supportive and can be destructive and oppressive in some moments. But I think part of the systemic challenges is stigma is part of the systemic challenge. And in our work with Calm, Clear Answers to Louisiana, mental health, our work is to reduce stigma. And I'm curious, in your work around the world and locally, where are you seeing or how are you seeing stigma show up, both big and small?
Yeah, well, I think it leads on from my last point that I actually think sometimes a predominant psychiatric paradigm can be quite stigmatizing in the sense that people have this idea that, mental illness is somehow solely, genetic or within the person, or it's nature rather than nurture. I think that there's obviously stigma around, suicide and the criminalization of suicide around the world that's still very pervasive, along with other intersections of, homosexuality and being, transgender still intersecting with a lot of stigma in that context. But all the research and advocacy around stigma at the moment is around social contact, and if people have access to someone, usually a meaningful relationship of some sort, or positive experiences in the media with people that have been branded with these labels. And as we know, some diagnoses are more stigmatizing than others, that if people have positive contact and really get to see people as humans, as other compassionate, empathic humans, that is a primary driver for changing the sorts of attitudes and beliefs people have around folks, living with diagnoses such as schizophrenia, psychosis, bipolar, where a lot of the stigma and underlying beliefs around madness are that, we should fear, people are socialized to fear people with those diagnoses, or socialized that the people living with those diagnoses are unpredictable or unreliable. There's a lot of those public narratives that we see perpetuated in the media and through film and TV. So a lot of the reversal and unlearning of that is having contact with people with those diagnoses that challenge those, attitudes, values, and beliefs that we've been socialized into.
Yeah, I actually work in the forensic hospital as well. I just came from there this morning. And when you think about, I think it feels overwhelming for people on all sides to think of the vastness of the issues, which brings itself a lot of hopelessness when you feel like I'm just interacting with one person. Like, how is there ever going to be change in sort of the like just day-to-day practice? But like this morning at the hospital, there was a new nurse, her first day, and this is most of my patients have an NGRI issue, and I was the first psychiatrist she had ever met in her nursing school and her pathway. And I was shocked, but then I was like, okay, Ashley, don't be upset. I was like, oh, well, this is going to be a good opportunity I'm going to be the first psychiatrist to hopefully set a tone for this person and her new career. And really realizing the impact that those moments have and can potentially have and have to happen over time to, not that I practice without major mistakes, but, I can believing in people's stories and hearing them and giving them space, no matter what the setting to be. I mean, today, my patient this morning, we talked about Kay Jamison's book. We have 4 books that we were going through with all of these like beautiful metaphors of his experience. And I was so happy that like the new dietitian and the new nurse could like be with him expressing himself. And it's like all those moments layered on. Maybe, there are some hopeful things in the mix of a very hopeless atmosphere. I mean, so it's like a responsibility is what I'm trying to say on both ends, on all ends, of making sure that you're living, your whatever your experience is in a way that's also inclusive of how you're relating with the people around you and from all of these different walks of life. Yeah, it was like a really nice moment to have new energy actually in the room. Made me feel very hopeful.
Yeah, it can be, there can be a lot of, moral injury and trauma
Mhm.
for, practitioners within the system that feel also oppressed and constrained by the limitations of, at the end of the day, what is a carceral it's a carceral system, even not just in forensics, but in any institutional environment. It is based on prison logic,
Yeah.
and that obviously is not set up for a care and healing environment.
Feels like that in the
But
intensive care unit,
yes,
quite
yeah.
frankly.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, people in the MAD movements initially, when they started collectively organizing, would categorize themselves with the labels of ex-patient or ex-inmate because it mirrored incarceration. This is in the early 70s around deinstitutionalization, but I think it's still very alive and real. And yeah, people are people and are trying to do the best that they can. And I think you make a good point around like the training as well of various disciplines and workforces, and yeah, how limiting they can be in terms of exposure to, even just other knowledge, whether that's, sociology knowledge or whether that's occupational knowledge. I mean, we can't know everything, but it is important to have, I think, better allied health, training for all practitioners. And now obviously there's stronger peer workforces and lived experience workforces that come with their own theories and knowledges and practices and values. So yeah, something more multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, I think, is important in future practice. As having more knowledge and awareness of multiple paradigms, I think I don't think is harmful unless it's not aligned with people's self-determination, choice, and agency,
Yeah. Well, one way that we're trying to provoke hope and to work across systems and across disciplines and across different groups of humans is through the creative arts and expression. And we have multiple components of our work, both at the clinic and within our early psychosis campaign. Storytelling, creative expression, all of that has been effective on our end. I'm curious to what extent you've seen that out in the world when you're doing this work and what role you believe it plays in terms of advocacy and education.
Yeah, well, I think anything creative or artistic, as you say, is about expression. I mean, it's deeply human, and people express their their mind, body, spirits in many different ways through many mediums. So I think it's central to have space, both in terms of time and resource, for people to be able to express themselves. And often distress or distressing madness, folks don't maybe have a verbal or vocabulary expression for that, in writing or in speaking form. So, again, the arts or other creative mediums are an outlet for people to be able to, channel what they're going through. And again, it might not be aligned with a psychiatric paradigm or framework. It might be something very spiritual or something very ancestral. Or so, yeah. It's art and the creative expression mediums have been very central to my own recovery in terms of stand-up comedy and theatre and other visual frameworks, and certainly around the world. I think, I don't know whether it's a correlation, but many mad folks really thrive in the art scene, and really art, both in terms of visual art and performance art, is seen as a cultural production in the mad movements. So mad pride as a sub movement of the mad movements is all about also valuing like the cultural production that we've been able to produce in society as mad people. So I think that it has a very strong place. But often, again, is relegated in that hierarchy of knowledge. The arts is sort of seen at the bottom of the pile with lived experience, and often, bureaucracy, medicine, law, like there's often quite a hierarchy of knowledge, within the psychiatric system. So I hope that we can work towards, plural ways of valuing different knowledges within the system, and then funding them in those ways as well, so that people, again, have those options to say, I think that maybe medication isn't working so well in this sector, in this part of my life, but, maybe writing or maybe, I don't know, other art mediums might work better for someone going through something. So, it's complicated, but it's very central, I think, in many, many folks' lives.
Yeah. I think complicated and not. You helped me to think of two examples recently that I think speak to the inclusion of and elevating of the importance of arts. One, Ashley and I were at the APA conference last year or the year before, and there was an offshoot at the conference of lived experience, and it was a comedy show, musical performances, all of this. It was amazing and super inspiring. And so, shout out to APA for having that be a part of it. I think that was very important and inspiring. And then at the clinic a couple of weeks ago, or during the month of May, I think it was, we have a medical student who is a ceramicist, and she offered to come into the clinic for a month and do ceramics with our patients. And so I got to sit in on one of those groups, and it was amazing because it wasn't like we were there. I mean, maybe some people were there with the intention of creating something awesome, but we were really just all sitting there with some clay, and we were working with our hands and creating things, creating from within. But it was a conversation also that came from us all sitting at the table, the conversation about people's hospitalizations, about their experience with the system and how they're challenging the system, how they're helping themselves. It was the art, the creativity created a cathartic space for all those who were at the table.
Yes, yeah. I know. I remember even my first hospitalization over a decade ago. The two most important people probably in that sort of 2-month period that I was in hospital was the student. There was no paid art therapist, of course, but she was a student art therapist, and the pastoral care, the spiritual care worker who worked across the general hospital and psychiatric unit. So again, they just came with a different lens, and one that felt very deeply human and compassionate. And there's something about, I don't know whether it's also just the tactile nature of working through things and thoughts and emotions whilst also processing with your hands and not having to directly speak or confront, quite serious topics that allow for expression. But totally echo those experiences that are really, profound and healing and cathartic.
And that came out of, from her perspective, was a conversation, because I can't remember how she found out I used to be a ballerina, but that's what she was like. How did you know when you had to stop, or if medical school was too much and you stopped dancing, because she was struggling with, she had her master's in fine arts and she was a ceramicist, and needing to have those parts of her life to be a better doctor. And I was like, come, do whatever you want. And she was just like, really? I'm like, yes, this is for you to be healthy and learn and like feel all of the cool things about you that make you you, like you need to have an outlet to do those things. So it was just this mutually beneficial thing from so many different lenses. And with all of our medical students, because we do have a school of medicine, we have a lot of people in and out in various ways, just really encouraging them but to acknowledge those parts of themselves that sometimes get become less of a priority when the stakes become high in other ways.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, even like mad studies as a discipline, that looks at the sort of history, philosophy, and politics of mad people and mad people's movements. The very strong lived experience-led knowledges around paradigms for understanding distress and madness are often, about the embodied forms of knowledge that we have in distress and madness, or the relational forms of knowledge that we have within us, and also the expressive and creative forms, along with the sort of social, cultural, structural, political. So I think from an individual perspective, like within like lived experience movements, the embodied, creative, and relational are often centered. So it's interesting that we're having this chat around what that actually looks like in practice. And wouldn't that be amazing if a psychiatrist brought their artistic, trainings or interests and hobbies into their, practices, and had the time and energy and capacity to do that sort of relational work with people,
Yeah. I've tried to get some of my patients to let me teach them Pilates, and they say, yes, no, thank you, Dr. Weiss.
Yeah. Also fair enough.
You next time, right?
I'd probably say the same thing. I'm very inflexible. So I'd say thanks for no thanks.
Not happening, but thanks for offering. Thanks for the offer.
Yeah, but it's a very human, again, it's about humanizing. I think a lot of the psychiatric paradigm takes the humanness out of, who we all are, both as practitioners, as service users or survivors in systems, and rehumanizing us with, what our interests and hobbies and skill sets are outside of this mental health industrial complex is really important, in terms of relationship building.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And so I want to, as we move towards closing, I just want to bring it back to the individual and the listeners who are out there today who maybe are experiencing symptoms, maybe fear they're experiencing symptoms. What advice would you have for them around their voice, sharing with them or helping them to understand why their voice matters in this work that we're doing?
I think, voice, as I mentioned, self-determination, agency, choice, empowerment are all, central pillars of the MAD movements or lived experience movements. And I think being able to find your voice and feel empowered to exercise your voice and agency, whether that be, with friends and family or with treaters or services, is really important. And I think by getting to a point of feeling empowered, it's important to be able to have the knowledge and access to resources to know what your rights are, to know the different explanatory frameworks of your experiences. Yeah, people might use the term symptoms, they might use other terms, but I think it's really around finding access to communities that have had similar experiences. So I live with, manic depression. I feel like that's a more accurate term for my experiences than the term bipolar. But I've certainly sought out other folks that say in the Hearing Voices movements or other folks in Mad Pride, where often mania is viewed as like a spiritual gift in our communities as well. So it's a very different framework to like a pathology framework of mania. And trying to find and tether the experiences that, maybe don't become destructive, or how do you harness the gifts and creativities and strengths that come out of experiences of distress and madness without it becoming destructive, and I don't think they're often conversations I've had with psychiatrists myself, but often us as peers have in our communities around, this hasn't all been a bad thing. How do I sort of harness those gifts? So I think it's really about finding community and having options and talking to different people and finding the right providers that are on your page with your, I guess, a similar ideology or similar framework. So my psychiatrist is great. She's also a child and adolescent psychiatrist and comes from a trauma background and is very political and really quirky. like myself. So, I really needed someone that had a very strong political determinant perspective, which sometimes is a bit antithesis to a psychiatric paradigm. But that's what works for me, and we've been able to find a really happy medium where she just jokes to me and says, "Oh yeah, it's all capitalism, isn't it, Matt?" And but I need that in my treater, and we obviously can have chats about sleep and medication and managing my mood, but yeah, having someone that's on the same page of my frameworks is really important. And I think we can only do that by knowing what's out there and accessing our peer support systems and speaking to family and other people that have been through it.
I really appreciate several of the points there, because I think you bring up something that we maybe don't talk about enough about voice within treatment. We talk about, but asking questions, requesting things, reframing things for oneself so that one can feel empowered in the context of, the system that can often feel is working against them. And you bring up rapport, and we talk about this all the time at our clinic, and it's all about rapport, and it's about finding that other human in the world who, can support you and respect you for who you are in the context of this moment in your journey.
Yeah.
Ashley, any final question before we wrap up?
When are you coming to New Orleans? We need to have you come visit.
It's very funny. My oldest half sister, who I'm closest with, lives in Austin with my brother-in-law and kids. So I was supposed to be going down to New Orleans at some point when I was visiting them. So it'll probably be next year at this point, given, the political climate and situation at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually supposed to be at Yale instead of Canada, but because of the shutdowns and delays with visa interviews and just, it just wasn't the right time. So hopefully the US will be a better time to come next year.
We share the same sentiment.
Yes. We live in a maddening world at the moment. So how we make sense of that and respond to that is also an important part of all this discussion.
One of my, I can't say I have favorites, but one of my favorite patients is like, why do I have to come and talk to you when there's people with active delusions, operating major countries, at any given moment? And I was like, truth. I mean, I have no idea. How are we going to manage this together? Because it is it's a point of deep connection right now in this country and probably elsewhere too of how to get through this. I won't talk about that anymore. But when you do come to New Orleans or come to the South, we'd love to have you at the clinic, where Serena and I are party people and really just want to have good times with all of the people that we can surround ourselves in our orbit with. Yes. So it was lovely talking to you and meeting you.
Yeah, well, I'm interested in sort of building some bridges with, all people that are within the right value set and mindset. I think historically psychiatrists have been sort of demonized in the MAD movements. And, there's obviously a very littered history of problems. But I think there's also, we need to be thinking about people that are on the same page and how we can find people that are our allies, because even in lived experience spaces, there are a lot of people with horrible politics that are not aligned with MAD movement's values. So I'm also very interested in hearing from psychiatrists about what a more compassionate, humane, system, or maybe not system, what a world looks like where people that live with distress and madness are supported, cared, loved, healed. I think that we're all yearning for that as people in the mental health system. So I'm glad that we can start this dialogue and look forward to coming along and hanging out in person sometime.
Yeah, for sure. It's an open invitation down to New Orleans. Well, thank you for your time, Matt. We really enjoyed speaking with you.
Amazing. Thank you.